Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin. I'm joined by Richard. Say hello to the yes, Richard.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. And this sounds like it should be a great episode, so I'm looking forward to being a part of it. And I'll let Nick get right into it.
All right, I think I always talk about propaganda. I talk about illusions. And I talk about kind of like where we kind of think things are. And today I want to attack something broad, but then I'm going to kind of show some practical applications of like how it really works, how I see it working. And what I want to attack today is kind of like how we have this idea of how something may or may not work, and it kind of shapes the way we perceive goals politically, but we're kind of forgetting how politics actually works. And so what I mean by this is like I'll engage with people and I'll talk, with leftists and liberals alike. I don't talk to as many right wingers as I should, and I need to go back to that. But it's already hard enough to get like the center left person to even get what you're trying to get at, and they agree with you. They just don't know that they agree with you in principle, but their actions are actually anatomically opposed to what you're trying to achieve, and anatomically opposed to what they're trying to achieve. They just aren't aware. And to me, that's hard to work with. And imagine somebody else who may not even believe what's necessary and may not even believe, even more than that. And it's just like, okay, there's only so much one man can do, right?
Oh
But
yeah,
go
it can be
ahead.
tough. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think those things are very, very difficult. So, I need to just go back to talking to hardcore right wingers and libertarians in particular because they're the farthest gone, at this point. But I kind of ran it right there. What I want to talk about is understanding your own circumstance. And I think, the problem that we have in society right now is that we tend to kind of believe that society is like, how can I say this? It's like made up of individuals. And what I mean when I say that is that if this works for one individual, that means that same case will work for a numerous amount of individuals. And then like I can also say that this case will then work for the collective of individuals. And the problem with that line of thought is that first off, it's not real. Like one person doing something or two people doing something may not be a big deal. But when you have everybody doing something, it creates something completely different because one person doing something affects someone else and may change what they do and vice versa. So there's feedbacks in the system. So what they call it is like a complex system, meaning like each individual or like the entity as a whole is more than just the sum of its parts. Like when you try to add all those parts together and you get like a collective whole, you have something that acts very, very differently from each individual part by itself. And so like getting that through our heads and like really digesting what that means is going to be so helpful to us when we talk about, addressing, problems. So let's talk about addressing like a political problem that we may have here in the United States. United States, we have tons and tons of problems, but let's say I want to address anyone. Let's take mass incarceration. I was recently talking about mass incarceration, so I'm just going to pick this topic. And I proposed to somebody that a federal jobs guarantee is probably key to really starting to get to address mass incarceration. And right off the bat, what do you think about that, Richard?
Well, I mean, I know you're very partial to your federal jobs guarantee, and I didn't know for legitimate reasons. I'm somewhat skeptical of it, and I know we don't want to make the show about the federal jobs guarantee, so I won't say anything about that specifically. But I do carry on your point about the difference between individualistic behavior and collective behavior and how that shapes what's actually happening. And we can think of several examples from the different parts of a cell, or one that's commonly used, I think that people might be familiar with, is saving activity. If one person saves all of their money and spends as little as possible, that has a negligible impact on the economy. But if an entire nation saves as many, like every penny they can, and spends as little, that has a very different impact on the national economy. And so I think that's a really important point, and I think it's critical that that if people want to understand what kind of ideology or whatever is going to help them along the way, that's one of the things that they're going to have to consider in the implications of their ideology. Is it does it work if I do it, and does it work if everybody starts acting the way I'm acting, or I think people should act? But go ahead.
Okay, so here's the thing. Like, I think most of the time when I talk about the federal jobs guarantee, like the number one thing that I run into is that people seem to just think it's just a job and that nothing else will change. And it's again, it's because you're looking at things as if it's just one piece of something, and
I,
that you're not understanding it's a complex system. When you do that one thing, it affects a lot of other things, and so the political economy changes. So we have something called a political economy, and what that means is basically politics right now is arranged as like a group activity. So basically, you have groups that have interests, and then they use their power to basically go about getting their policies put forth. So we have an issue in mass incarceration where we have a large group of people that are incarcerated, but the only people that care about those people are them. So a lot of times, I mean, let me say, instead of using words like them and these and those and oppressed groups and things, I'm talking about black people. This is like a huge black issue, and I don't think I need to beat around the bush with that. But what I want to say is nobody cares about black people but black people. So thus, if we're talking about how to solve an issue that directly impacts black people and nobody else cares about them but black people, the first clue would be, hey, if we're engaging in a political economy, this seems to be a political problem. How can we go about it in a political way that we can solve this? Okay, well, first off, we have to say, well, how come the problem hasn't been solved? And the real answer to that is black people lack the political power to achieve a lofty goal such as, the end of mass incarceration on their own. So why do we lack what would help us get political power? Well, first off, we need more people to be engaged in the struggle in general. Like, a lot of people just are unplugged. So 1 second, I need to actually respond to this really, really quickly. Take over for me, Richard. Can you kind of agree or disagree? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point in that the yeah, I'd ask. I guess I'd add that there's also the aspect of that there's a very large group of people with countervailing interests in something like mass incarceration. That that liberation of the people that are suffering from it would come at the direct expense, both literally and figuratively, of the people that are profiting off of it. And so, not only do black people need to overcome just a lackadaisical care for their problems, they have to overcome the fact that there's a group of people that have an interest in perpetuating those problems for profit.
So I'll agree to that. And here's what I'll say to that. I believe that an empowered community will actually have the needed political power to actually rub up against that. The problem, though, is it's not just individuals that profit very greatly. There's mass incarceration, the prison industry. It is an industry. It's got that word on the back of it, industry. So, like, you have people that may not necessarily agree with mass incarceration from a moral standpoint, but there's entire counties that, if the prison system were to be downsized, that county would be destroyed. And so, to overcome that, you would need something like a federal jobs guarantee to kind of alleviate the financial incentive for people to support a morally corrupt system or a morally corrupt structure, as like their subsistence. And so, like, again, this is the key. This is part of why the federal jobs guarantee and an infrastructure program is really, really key to kind of helping us deal with how can you dismantle the the state of mass incarceration or the carceral state.
Yeah, I think if I'm viewing the federal jobs guarantee as more of a short term solution and addressing some of the issues as you mentioned in that way, I think I become more receptive of the idea. I'm not totally off put by the idea. I'm just skeptical. So it's not as if I'm totally out of bounds. I would just say that that there's. Or go ahead. I could tell.
No, no, no. I mean, finish your thought. I'm going to say something else.
Okay. Well, I had another point regarding the the process in which that we acquire and maintain political control. In that it's a difficult process. You said that people need to be woken up, have to be engaged, and I think that that hurdle itself is going to be a difficult one to overcome.
I think it's easier to overcome if we can get out of a constant state of emergency. Like I think we have a situation where being on the bottom, as we are structurally, black people are on the bottom. I don't need to have to prove that. I think that's fairly clear. So we're going to work on some assumptions here. I'm not necessarily going to prove everything, but I'm kind of working off of that. Everybody comes to this conversation with a little bit of basics here and there because I'm going to kind of pull from it, but I don't want to have to get sidetracked having to really lay out a whole bunch every time because I've been told as I go back and watch my shows that I kind of do like an information overload. So I don't want to overload you with information. So to keep from doing that, I'm going to start just trying to get at exactly what I'm talking about and trust that if I'm pulling from information that I'm assuming I'll just say it like, hey, I'm assuming you know this. I'm kind of gonna do that moving forward. I hope you guys will appreciate that. That way, I don't have to have diarrhea of the mouth. Whenever I try to make like something that should be a simple point, but requires a lot of background information, I shouldn't have to go and just blah, blah, blah. Shouldn't have to shoot that out there like that.
And I know Nick likes checking in on the comment sections on the video. So if you do have an issue where you want to clarify something like that, I know Nick's really good about interacting with those. So I would advise if that comes up for someone to go there.
Oh yeah. And to double down on what Richard just said, I have a small enough audience and enough time on my hands that every time anybody makes a comment on any of my videos, I pretty much have a response. So if you have a question or if you didn't like what I had to say, I'm more than open to discussing it, and I can, basically give you links. I can reference books that I'm pulling from. It's a good place where I can kind of share information with you because right now my audience is extremely small. So I can pretty much every comment that you throw up there, I'll see it and I can pretty much respond to it. Now, if I had a huge platform, that may or may not be possible anymore. But I'll let you guys know when we cross that threshold. I doubt, that we'll be there anytime soon. So
get in while it's good, people. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. We got sidetracked here, but we were talking about what political economy, right?
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about how waking people up in general, and then you had a carry on point that you were gonna add on.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're always in the constant state of emergency. See, I've got my notes right here. We're always in a constant state of emergency. So like, there's a study where if you're always in a constant state of emergency, then your life is terrible. You don't have a lot of opportunities, and things are kind of hectic. Like you just taking it day by day. That kind of locks you out from engaging in the political process the way a lot of other people who have leisure time, as I like to put it, who have a lot of leisure time have to engage in the political process. So I think one of the greatest barriers, for us typically has been that so many of our community are not engaged in politics and they're just struggling to survive and make it day to day, that they don't pay attention to what's going on around them. And it's because, in all honesty, where they're situated in life, they just don't have the luxury to spend a lot of leisure time paying attention to these things. And you could say, excuse me, and you can say, yeah, everybody should pay attention to this and everybody should pay attention to that. But I can guarantee you that if you trade places with anybody who's really, really struggling, like working 2 and 3 jobs and like, they're all minimum wage and you live in a terrible area and you live that life, you would think very, very differently about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just anecdotally, I recently went to the March for Our Lives rally that was locally in where I'm at in Washington, in Tacoma. And it was interesting. Tacoma, for those who aren't familiar, is basically the blackest city in the state, and it was on Martin Luther King Way, and one of the blackest areas in Tacoma. So, if you look at the demographics by block, but when I got there, there was essentially very few black people there, probably maybe 1 to 2 dozen out of nearly 1,000 people, and so I thought that was interesting. And one of the people that I had actually come across during the march was somebody who worked right there on Martin Luther King Jr. Way, at a resource center for the community. And when I was talking to her, she was a young black woman, probably mixed, but she was unaware. One of the things that caught my attention is she was critical of those who weren't there, like as Nick mentions, in those sorts of circumstances, in that she was like, if they can't get engaged, it's on them. And I thought that was a really tough thing for somebody in her position to be arguing. And then also what was concerning for me was she was unaware of who Fred Hampton was, which I think strikes back to the point of understanding our position and where we are in this society, in that if you don't understand that the government has already taken some rising stars and essentially murdered them and face no consequences, then you're not going to really be prepared about what battles we have in front of us. But so I just wanted to get that in there. It's personal.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point. You said she said, for those people who aren't there, that's on them. And see, I think we've kind of gotten away from the understanding like of what freedom really is. Like, I think one of the biggest consequences of having like an individual view is that we think that like your individual choices represent your freedom. And this has been something that people have been wrestling with. I mean, I'm sorry, that has been wrestled with and put to bed long ago. I want to say back when we had the labor struggles of the United States, like there was a huge struggle between farmers and basically farmers in the western states along the border of where slavery stopped. They didn't want to be next to slave states, and they had like huge bloody battles because they realized that like as a farmer, you can't compete with slave labor. So basically they had a bloody struggle, not because necessarily they cared about the fate of human beings, other human beings that were subjugated to slavery or treated as chattel, but because they understood that so long as they were in direct competition with slave labor, they weren't free. They considered themselves what's called a wage slave, and because they understood that where they were, positionally, they understood where their position was. They were able to mount a political contest to assert that without these certain things, they didn't feel free. And I think we've kind of lost that. And I would even say, the struggle in the United States in the 60s, after, when you have people like Fred Hampton, they were trying to start gearing the struggle towards true freedom, away from like this idea that you have choices and these choices just dictate your outcomes. It's really about, do you have freedom in both the form and content? And so the thing is, let me basically put an illustration out there so everybody understands what I'm talking about when I say form and content of freedom. Let's say you're going to bake a cake and you have some of the materials you need, but not all of them. And I'm like, all right, everybody can bake cakes. But one group, I'm going to give them everything that they need. I'm going to ensure that they have the flour, bread, the eggs. I'm giving them the oven. I'm going to make sure they have electricity. And then another group, I'm going to say, you can't bake eggs. I mean, you can't bake cakes. And so one group's been baking cakes and they've been doing their thing. And then finally I say, all right, I'm going to let the second group bake cakes as well. But I'm not going to provide any materials. You have to come up with those materials on your own. And if you can't come up with those materials on your own, I'm just going to say, well, you're now free to bake cakes, but only if you can afford the materials. And the realization is like, but I gave the materials to the other group. I gave it to them so that they could exercise that freedom. But now I'm telling you that you can only exercise the freedom if you can provide the materials for yourself. So what I've done there is I haven't necessarily freed you. What I have done is I basically made you aware of a privilege that you can exercise. Whereas the other group, I've actually empowered them and made them free. And so that's why when I talk about a job guarantee, that's what I see it as. I see it as we can perform the policy in such a way that we actually start freeing people so that they can have leisure time, vacation time, time to engage in the political sphere. so they can not live a precarious or unstable life where they don't really have time to engage in the political process. And since, again, we're going all the way back now. I mean, I'm doubling down, doubling down, doubling down. Since we have a community that disproportionately suffers from this and disproportionately is not engaged in the political sphere the way we should be, a policy like the federal jobs guarantee could be critical. It could be a critical key to really getting that engagement going. Now, that's not to say it's a one-shot thing. I'm not saying you just snap your fingers and boom, it's gone tomorrow. But at least at this point, we have a situation where now it's like, okay, we've opened up some passage, we've opened up some space here. Now we actually have, all the ingredients we need. Now we can start trying to bake a cake. And now it's actually going to be a situation where we actually have some space to kind of maneuver. And that's what I see it as.
And I think the points, there's an episode going back that maybe we'll go ahead and throw a link in the description, so if people are interested, when we talked a little bit more extensively about the federal jobs guarantee versus UBI. But one of the things you did with your argument about the federal jobs guarantee, you did a good job of reminding me of some of the shortcomings of a UBI. But I also fear that in the application or the pursuit of what you're talking about, we end up with a lot of the same problems with we would get with a UBI being implemented in our modern political sphere, where rather than actually used to empower the people in the ways that you describe, it would be used more to let the government off the hook for some of the social safety nets that are already in place, and use it as to offset a budgeting issue in a way, rather than actually empower the people in the way that you're talking about. I think it within the revolutionary struggle and within that framework, the idea of a federal jobs guarantee, I think, would serve the roles that you are. I think within the neoliberal, two-party system that we have currently, it ends up looking more like a tool to be abused by those in power to do the similar things that we discussed with the shortcomings of the UBI. But go ahead.
So again, anything that's done politically can run the risk of being perverted in one way or another. But I believe that if the people are adamant and if we're really involved and engaged, like, it could be the key to the kingdom. And I believe some other notable figures, namely Martin Luther King and some other people along the way, those who I may or may not name. I believe Malcolm was also in favor of the job guarantee, but I think he was more so kind of like preaching more like a self-sufficiency. But that was in a different time. Like, I think it's clear that, by now we understand that self-sufficiency isn't possible. And just to start kind of moving away from that, another example, since we're kind of in this vein of kind of like believing in things that may or may not be possible, is this idea of black banking. And it puzzles me, because underlying the idea of black banking is a misunderstanding of how banks work. And rather than teach everybody about how banks work, what I'm going to tell you is that a bank performs a vital function. It is able to multiply capital in ways that empower things to happen, but it does these things through money creation when it issues out loans and stuff, not necessarily like by borrowing and then like acting as an intermediary. That's like a very, very old school way of looking at banking. It doesn't do that anymore. Imagine a bank as basically able to give a loan with one hand and receive the loan on the other hand, but they're on both sides of the equation for the most part. That's how they do. That's when they make a loan, they have two things. They have an asset and a liability, and they net to zero to them, and they just pass the stuff around. And somebody will say, well, how is a loan an asset, not a liability? I was like, well, think about it. If you have somebody who signed an agreement to pay you a certain amount every month for 30 years, you have that piece of paper, a legal agreement. Basically, he's consigned himself to paying you this amount of money for 30 years. That has a monetary value. It's an asset. It's not a liability. Like, you have somebody paying you every month. That is an asset. And that asset has a value, and its value really is the amount of amortized payments. That's the value of that loan. And so because they have that, they can sell that to somebody else. Somebody else will buy it from them. And the liability was only the money that they gave you, right? But after you spend it somewhere else, you've moved the liability because their liability is the money that they give you. If they give it to you and you spend it somewhere else, they no longer owe you anything. Their liability's gone. They have an asset that you move the liability somewhere else. What's to stop them from doing whatever else they want with it, right? Like that's really how it works, guys.
Yeah, and that's really at the root of what caused the financial crisis in 2008. Essentially, was the misvaluation of those assets, and they earned the name toxic assets because essentially the agencies that we put in charge of rating them and determining how the one other component, the likelihood that those payments are going to continue and are going to arrive, was being grossly misrated. And so like when something that fundamental to the banking system is so fundamentally flawed, that's how you end up with a huge failure. And to Nick's point about the printing money aspect, the way that they were bailed out of that situation was by the federal government printing a bunch of money and handing it over to them either at zero or in some cases even negative interest rates. But that's a whole
so and again, I think we're kind of being too physical here. We're at the point now where money isn't just printed money. Money is electronic. You don't have to print anything. We don't have to waste any resources on it. You can actually just, press a few buttons on a keyboard and there it is. So there's no actual real resource tied to it whatsoever. At least with printing, you have to burn paper, right?
Yeah, well,
you don't have to do that with electronic money.
Another way this manifests is the debate about whether we're going to keep pennies at all, just because they cost more to make than they're worth. And so that's another way that we've seen it manifest in our economy, in our everyday lives, and a material that we see on a daily basis. I'm sure there's some people that still quite value pennies and would be hurt to see them gone. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too far off on that. See, I said I'm not going to explain how the banking works, and we went on ahead and explained it anyway. As best we could. We're not going to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
But if you guys want to look it up, it's called endogenous money. If you basically type that in, you can find lots of information on how it actually works, on how banking works, on how money from a sovereign currency issuer works. You can look up those things and basically get a better understanding of what we're talking about here. But for the purposes of this, I'm talking specifically about black banks. And like what I want to say is that black banks, first and foremost, is a propaganda, is an illusion put out there to play on your emotion. And what I mean by that is, so if you want to talk about like a community bank that has a charter and it functions, as a way of being an intermediary, taking capital from people and then loaning it out to other people. If you can find a community bank that still operates like that, a community bank can be okay for the most part. But generally speaking, a financial crisis happens or any type of crisis happens, that community bank doesn't have the capital or the backing required to really survive those types of things. Generally speaking, throughout history, there have been several Black-owned or Black community banks that have popped up, and each of them has failed in one way or another. And I think there's a good book by Mersha Baradaran called "The Color of Money: Black Banks and the History of Black Wealth Gap." What they can do, what they can't do, things of that nature. She kind of chronicles that, so we can kind of understand what we're saying. But the key takeaway from this is like this idea that if you take your money, you take it out of a traditional large scale, white bank, and you take it to a black bank, and not a community bank, like a bank that's just owned by Black people, which also doesn't make any sense, right? But you take it to this bank and it's supposed to do something. Here's the problem. They're going to take that money and they're going to invest it right back with the same white institutions that the white banks invested in, except they're going to have less return on investment because they have less capital to work with, and they're going to be more riskier in general. So what did you really do there? You feel good about it, but as far as like community uplift or doing something for your community, you've done nothing. Not unless the bank was chartered and specifically required to do something that banks can do that can empower a community, would it actually work out in a favorable manner. But then you wouldn't have a Black bank. What you have is a community bank. Basically a bank that's chartered to and basically regulated or mandated to serve the community. And I think that's why people kind of mix the two things, like a Black bank and a community bank are the same things. Like, no, they're not. And then they'll say, well, let's say I'll explain all this to somebody. They'll say, well, Black banking is not a bad idea per se. And I'm like, well, what do you mean not a bad idea? I just explained to you that it's a worthless idea. But still, because your mind is so attached to the idea of having a bank owned by black people and that meaning something, that even when I explain to you that it means nothing, that you, number one, you can't segregate your money. In America, all money is like flowing together, right? You can't segregate it. There's not like money in this community and money in that community, and we can kind of keep them separate if we do the black bank or something. No, that's not how it works. It doesn't work like that at all. So because it doesn't work like that, the idea of a bank being owned by black people being like a community uplift or something like that, it's garbage. And we need just to let go of it. Let go of it as quickly as possible, because if we hold on to it, you're just going to fall prey to predators that want to prey on your emotions. They want to prey on your aspirations to have something, represent you and be powerful and big or whatever. They're just going to prey on that and just take your money.
Yeah, there's a few, like, I think you point out a few things that I think are important. One of them is just how black banking lends itself towards the reinforcement of capitalism. And so for those of us on the left that aren't huge fans of capitalism in itself, the idea of black banking is problematic there. Also, one of the things that stands out to me is the notion that if we put, black skin on something, that then it becomes better and less likely to, and it becomes an impossibility to abuse the people that look like that person. I think that's problematic in that we have to hold people accountable regardless of what they look like. And so while black ownership may in the long term increase the odds that black people will be higher in the consideration, there were plenty of black overseers on plenty of plantations, and plenty of black folks that helped facilitate slavery and helped do all sorts of things. So it's not as if positionally our society is capable of turning anybody against their own. And so simply putting putting black in front of banking doesn't make banking better. And I think that's really a critical point. And then finally, I guess, as far as the value of it, I do see one particular aspect, and this, full disclosure, this was a bit of a discussion before in DMs or whatever, but that what black banking does is, if you're at a bank, if you have a bank account and it's currently at Bank of America, it could be marginally better to be, especially if you can find a community style, as Nick pointed out, black-owned bank. But even if it's just at a black bank, it's a very marginal and small victory, and as long as you recognize it as that very small difference, then I think it's fine to also appreciate that very small betterment of not having your money with one of the known criminal organizations and having it with, this black-owned institution. However, and ideally one that you hold the higher standards than simply just being under black ownership. But go ahead.
Yeah, like the problem is that black banks just mean a black person or a group of black people own it, and that has nothing to do
get the qualification or to make it the words
and
true.
That's nothing to do with how the bank operates. And so if we're not talking about how the bank operates, then there should be no real distinction, because the problem with banks is not who owns them. The problem is how they operate, and that's more important than anything else. Any of that imagery about being independent, about building wealth, about all that kind of stuff, like none of that means anything, because what's the most important, all that's going to be decided by how the bank operates. And so if they operate like a traditional bank and they're just owned by a black person, there's no point in being there. You need a community bank. Then on top of this is also, I'll say, like things like, when I talk about community banks, this is why post office banking could be, a very useful tool, for uplifting the black community, because we have a lot of predators that are out there preying on black people not having bank accounts, not having access to electronic funds, the payday loan people, the checks cash places, like banking services like that. You can actually save the community tons of money and cut out that highly extractive industry just by having the post office act as a bank and allowing people even with bad credit to have accounts, and it just be a service. The government just has the government has the ability to open up something like that. And even if it loses money, it's not supposed to make money. It's a service. It's not supposed to be a profit-making institution. Therefore, having small accounts and things of that nature, though, that doesn't really necessarily hurt, the government to do that if they had like a banking infrastructure in the post office. Whereas a smaller bank, generally speaking, they want you to have larger accounts, and they want you to leave the money there and have it less frequently used if they're even working under like some sort of community schema. If they're just double entry bookkeeping and they're just issuing loans like that, none of that matters anyway.
Mm-hmm. It's, I think a very important point you bring up.
Yeah, so I think those are the two ones that really stuck out to me. Like, the idea that like, hey, because I'm not giving you a direct answer to what you think you're wanting to see, but I'm giving you an answer that literally tackles it from multiple angles. When we're talking about the federal jobs guarantee being a critical key to possibly being able to address mass incarceration. It's a political problem. We lack political power. How do we get political power? We increase our wealth position. How do we do that? That has to come through government policy. So we have to increase our wealth position first, alleviate some of our political tension on the opposite side, and then get more people engaged so we can actually start to go to war with these institutions that are highly invested in mass incarceration. And only when you do those things will you start making progress. You're not gonna make any progress otherwise.
Yeah, I was just going to say to your earlier point about recognizing where you are, it's important also that while tackling this endeavor that we keep in mind, and you alluded to it earlier talking about previous black banking institutions, that black people in this country have done the virtually impossible as described and lifted themselves by their bootstraps several times throughout this country's history, and several times that was systematically destroyed by countervailing forces, primarily white supremacist interests, that shut that down in the interest of, helping along some other less advantaged white folk or other billionaires. And so that if we're going to go about, increasing this wealth position as a means to enacting political change, we're going to have to be aware and cognizant of the forces acting against us. Essentially, we'll do anything. There's nothing they haven't done.
But basically, what you're saying is we can't have an objective and not be willing to take a look at the political economy. That's what you're saying. Like, I gave an answer. Basically, like I said, I gave an answer, and I'm like, hey, this will do these things, and I kind of gave a rundown, but it seemed like we weren't taking into account of what all really goes in. Another thing I said also is if you have a federal jobs guarantee in place, you have individuals that aren't being treated well by the private sector already, but now you have that same group that now have a criminal record and they're going to be treated by the private sector even worse. So we need to have things in place so when they come out that there's something for them to do, or else they will resort to crime. And, you're basically just empowering your political enemies at that point to make stronger cases against letting more people out of prison, and you'll probably see like a backlash where you'll see imprisonment rise back up again because criminality increased after that. But if you have a federal jobs guarantee, it kind of buffers against some of that, and you can kind of have some infrastructure in place where you can kind of start dealing with some of the issues that are going to come from letting a lot of people out of prison without kind of like having anything for them to do. So you have something there, you have things in place.
Yeah, and then maybe it's probably not fair to our audience because I doubt there's many of them in there, but I'm sure they have friends and family that are in this position. But the recognition of the failings of the Democratic Party and how they've played an instrumental role in the example that comes to my mind is Debbie Wasserman Schultz advocating on behalf of those predatory lending institutions that you mentioned, taking advantage of black people not having access to banking, and that her being essentially one of the leading figures in the Democratic Party up until she got caught with what she got caught doing, but essentially still ended up landing on her feet, getting support from Hillary Clinton in her ongoing campaign, and continues to get support from the Democratic Party. So one of our opponents in this type of empowerment isn't just going to be the Republicans and evil, conservatives, but it's going to be a large portion of the left, of what's at least the nominal left.
And what's so funny about this is because we live in a time right now where it seems like it's almost like everybody kind of acknowledges that mass incarceration is wrong. Yet we just haven't seen much movement on the issue. And what I hate to say is like I feel like some progressive groups may be suffering from some colorblind racism on their own. but they seem to be unwilling to acknowledge that mass incarceration is low hanging fruit. Like what we really need is empowerment of Black communities, to really start getting, the politics that we deserve. We can start actually, kind of beginning to come at these other groups. Like, how they have the big tent, like progressivism is this big tent and stuff like that. Well, we need to empower ourselves so we can come at these groups as equals and be engaged and understand the political economy and really start maneuvering within that realm to kind of make a lot of things more possible for us. I think, when I was talking to somebody about this very same thing, what they told me was, well, hey, Nick, they used a personal example. They used a personal example of how, what I was saying, it makes sense, but at the individual level. And I was like, again, you can't go back to the individual level, but they gave it anyway. And I was like, why am I having to sit here, listen to this long drawn out story about your individual experience, not even your individual experience, your father's individual experience. And we're talking about somebody who came of age, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm thinking to myself, like, if it weren't for Martin Luther King, your father wouldn't have been shit. He wouldn't have done anything. Like, the struggles of people in the 60s opened the door for the success that, our parents are eating off of. But like, he just seemed like, oh, all you got to do is do hard work. It's like, no, man. They opened space for him to basically be able to operate. And we saw as soon as basically the struggle or the political contention or the political will to keep that space open kind of relaxed, it started to close back up. And now we're seeing like, we're starting to kind of backslide, and we haven't made progress since that point. And it's because we're not doing politics. We're not engaged in the political economy in the way that we should be. And like, he just looked at me when I said that. He was like, oh, are you saying he wouldn't have done anything or he didn't deserve to do anything? Of course he deserved whatever he got. I'm just saying he operated from within a space that was opened up by political action of other groups, of other people. And that's what needs to happen now if we're to move forward. What were you about to say, Richard? I'm sorry, I kind of rambled.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that that I had an example in mind, but sorry, I had a distraction in the room, so go ahead.
And I'm gonna say something else he said to me. He said, well, was World War I fought the same way World War II was fought? And I was like, what? What do you mean? No. To me, the correct analogy would be you fought World War I as trench warfare, and then when World War II came, you just decided to stop fighting. You just let the enemy just roll over you. That's what it seems like to me that you're really saying. You're saying like, now you don't fight by engaging in the political arena. Now you fight by trying to basically struggle and do something on your own in a system that's arrayed against you, in a world where, power is exercised by groups and really, really powerful individuals. And I can tell you right now, none of us are really, really powerful individuals. That's just not how that works. As a group, we're weak, and as individuals, we're even weaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and the thing is that you can individually find success. Like you can look into various industries, whether music industry, sports industry, where you find individuals that have individual success stories where they overcome impossible odds and achieve some sort of economic freedom. Although we find frequently that Michael Bennett, for example, getting charged in Texas, or one thing after another, that even when you get into a comparable economic position, that the social political economy still puts you in such a position that your power is still very limited as an individual. And also that the system will exploit people seeking individual success, and in exchange for your individual success, they expect you to help hold down everybody else in whatever way is fitting for the position that you're in. And so in a lot of ways, and I think that's part of the struggle that pairs back a little bit to what you were talking about earlier, in that I think a lot of people run up against this in their life of interacting with, working for, buying from people or corporations that are in opposition to their ideals. And I think that struggle that people come with, whether it's choosing a bank, or whether it's choosing a job, or whether it's figuring out how you're just going to make it day to day, I think a lot of people focus more on the the daily impact of that in their lives, then they are able to expand on the larger and see it from the larger perspective of I'm one unit in a much larger political entity, and by uniting with that political entity, I empower myself and that entity. It takes a lot
Yes.
of time and thinking.
Yes, and I mean, basically, just double down on that. Remember what I just said. Power is something exercised by groups and extremely powerful individuals, like very, very, very powerful individuals that can exercise power singularly as a one person, and then groups of people can exercise power. But we're the weakest group. We're on the bottom. We're structurally on the bottom, and you want to go it alone and be an individual, where you're
Well,
even weaker than being with a group,
and for
and you're
every
already.
group above us, it's in their interest to keep us beneath them. And so the only way that we're really going to be able to, in my opinion, be able to acquire that type of power is by first uniting at the bottom together, and then incorporating all of the groups that are slightly above us in this social political hierarchy in until we get to where our group is bigger than the group that we're opposing, and more powerful by way of influence, by just mass number and the depth of which we're a part of the industry, kind of like a Fight Club type of thing, and that we're everywhere, we're the people who make all the wheels turn. And so you have to, our power supersedes yours in that way. And so
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm not quite 100% on it
Mm-hmm.
working quite like that. But to be honest with you, at that point, we would kind of be looking into a crystal ball. So I don't want to double down and say it will work quite like that. I'm just saying it will work out better for us in some way. Maybe it's an overwhelming force kind of thing. Maybe it's a strategic placement of usage of power or something like that. We're smaller, but we're able to use our power in certain places where it amplifies. And even though we might be smaller or less powerful, we're using it in the right place for the right thing. And whatever's going on in the moment may just be with us, where we have basically the winds at our backs instead of at our faces, and we're able to kind of just roll through and do something. It may be something like that. It may be that we don't even know what's possible until we get out there, and then all of a sudden something happens and it opens up in front of us. That a lot of things are really decided that way. Like, nobody knew that when they set out to do this that it would be this big thing. And you'll always hear these accounts of people recalling what they were saying. We set out here, we never dreamed that we would do X, Y, and Z. We never thought that we would do X, Y, and Z, and nobody knew it would be as big as it was until it was. And we're looking back and we were all a part of it. They're telling the story about struggle. They're telling the story about political contestation. They're telling the story about getting out there and being involved in something. And the key thing that you want to take away from that is nobody knew what it was going to be when they went out there. Nobody knew anything. So, a lot of times I'll hear people asking for some kind of plan. Number one is, even if I gave you a plan, if I was qualified enough to give you a plan, you probably wouldn't be qualified enough to understand what it is. I'm going to just throw it out there. Not saying I'm talking down to somebody, because you heard what I said. I'm not qualified to make the plan, and you're probably not even qualified to even judge any plan that I tried to make, and I'm unqualified, you're unqualified to read it. It's just that simple. Like, really what it is, sometimes we just have to get out there and kind of be out in the political wilderness and make something happen.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of Professor Eddie Glaude and the political imagination and how critical that is to our future. In that we can't be trapped in how we understand things today and presuming that this is how it is and how it always will be. That it was the imagination of the people in the '60s, the imagination of the slaves on on plantations of what a freedom could look like, that inspired and encouraged them to pursue it and take the necessary action, getting in the streets, doing the actions that it took to get there. And so I think it's really important that we don't limit ourselves to what we know to exist and how we know the political sphere to work in imagining a future. And so, but critical before achieving that future is uniting where in attaining that strength and then applying it with action and bringing it into the field. Those two things are where we're at, I think, right now in the struggle. I think a lot of people are waking up, and that's a process that will continue to build on itself. But the action is something that takes a very much of a conscious effort to maintain and improve, or else you end up, as you described earlier, where that relaxation means an encroachment from the power structures that would rather see that squashed.
Yeah, I mean, and here's what I would say. Like, I think I've talked about this before when I spoke with John Baraka, the Green
Mm-hmm.
Party vice presidential candidate. I spoke with him not too long ago on this show, and it's really incumbent upon everybody to kind of start getting out there and reading. I'm not saying you have to go back and read The Wealth of Nations. I'm not saying you. Well, to be honest with you, I would recommend that you read Capital Volume One, at the bare minimum. Common Sense, I would also recommend that you read these things, but like you need to read a lot of stuff to kind of start getting into the right mindset, because without you knowing, you know, culture has been working on you. The socialization process has been working on you since you were small. And that means you've imbibed stuff that's not necessarily productive to your best interest, like maneuvering inside the political arena, right? You've basically been force fed something, and to be honest with you, you're really going to have to go in with an open mind and kind of open up your mind a little bit more in terms of like learning how something may really work, learning about the history and context of things that happened in the past. Read about the labor struggle, read about it, read about the struggle of African Americans in the South to own and hold businesses, to hold land. Read about what happened in those stories. And don't read about it because you want to be entertained with something. Read about it because you want to learn something. You want to actually have some sort of knowledge about some of the things that happened in the past, and the lessons that you can learn. Because, there's a saying, you know, an idiot can't learn from his own mistakes. A smart man can learn from his own mistakes. And a wise man can learn from the experiences and mistakes of others. We need to start, everybody doesn't need to be a wise man. I'm not saying that, but we need to start basically, kind of like looking back to history and kind of gleaming that wisdom from the learned experiences of others, so that we can better interpret the material conditions in which we live and the context in which we find ourselves. Like when you do that, you really kind of move into a new stage where you look at politics completely different. And it's a transformation that all of us have to go through. I myself have gone through that transformation. And so that's why when I have these conversations with people, I have to remember, like, not everybody is going to go through that at the same pace. They haven't gone through that yet, but it's a process and it takes time for you to get there. And it takes a lot of effort from the individual, because they're going to have to put in some effort thinking about things and learning about things, and not just kind of regurgitating whatever they've been force fed.
I feel obligated at this time to both make a suggestion and a bit of a plug. I'm one of those folks that's going through that. I think in my own way, learning about more of the history and getting a better context of where we are and where we've been, and an invaluable tool in that has been Wendy Muse over at the at Left POC Project. There you can find her on Twitter. And over there, she's been diving into the history of leftists of color, and with also attention paid to a variety of different people. And we recently started a project called Reading Revolution, where we're taking primary documents, ideally from revolutionaries, and examining them and learning and understanding them better. And so one of our first episode was looking at History Will Absolve Me from Fidel Castro. And for those people who may not be able to sit down and read the 70 pages for one reason or another, there's other ways. This is just one example that you can kind of start to imbibe this type of information and absorb it in the ways that work for you. And so I advise checking that out. And all over Twitter, there's some really good information as well. Another project I'm working on, the Discourse with Brandon Sutton, also takes a lot of looks at some of the current issues from a lens that's much more black oriented, and with a deeper value on the historical context of things. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to both plug and to be a part of those projects. And I'm always looking out for more, and I'm glad to be a part of this with Nick. And all of what we're doing, all the people that I've seen, the leftists of color, and even at the Progressive Army, and just the people that I see taking this space that have noticed the opportunity provided because of this vacuum that we see because of lack of leadership by our political entities and political parties for them or for the people that they care about is really inspiring. And so for all the people that are doing all the work of getting this information and providing it to folks, I think it's the least that we can do to try and make an effort to absorb some of it by
Hold
listening or
on.
reading or whatever. Go ahead.
Hold on, Richard. You're making it seem like we're closing out. No, 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 no,
I
no,
just
no,
wanted
no,
to
no.
get that in, and we
I,
are
I've
close to an
actually
hour, but
got
we
one
can go
more
on.
thing that I actually want to talk about,
Mm.
and this is going to go out to basically leftist politics, in general. And what I want to say is there's been a lot of internalization of colorblind racism. And I think Wendy put a post up that said, white supremacy is a learned behavior, but its students come in many colors. And I think I take that to heart because a lot of times we have coalitions or groups that seem to refuse to acknowledge that they have a checkered history at best when it comes to working on issues with people that are already here. So what I'll say to that is like and on immigration in particular, like I've seen that the history on immigration has not necessarily been kind to Black folks, history wise, and yet I have not seen a lot of real interest from those groups in making sure that what they're doing is not necessarily requiring somebody be in coalition with you, but you're not willing to be in coalition with them. So basically, like, if you're talking about intra-group exchanges, we should be talking about a real exchange. Like if there's supposed to be a Big Ten and we're all supposed to be down behind a certain agenda, I think as of right now, we can honestly say with the situation of Black America being where it is, that, the progressive community really needs to do a lot better as far as addressing the direct issues that Black Americans suffer here in America. And I think I'm not wrong to ask for that. And if you feel like I'm divisive or like that's a wrong thing to ask for, or if your first instinct is to gravitate towards mass incarceration as like the low hanging fruit, like, we've got a problem. Because number one, you can't solve mass incarceration without some other things in place, without empowering the community that's really going to fight for that cause. Because you may not necessarily want to fight for that cause, right? You're not gonna get there without doing some other things first. And that's not all. Look at me, I'm tripping up over my words. It's also not the only way that you can be in coalition with somebody. That's not, a code word that makes my little ears poke up and be like, oh, he's really into it. No, 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 no. What I want to know is, what are you doing about a new anti-discrimination legislation to expand anti-discrimination? What are you doing to make sure that we have representation of not just Black females, but Black males in corporate America, in jobs? What are you doing to address those things? Now, if we can start getting some coalitions built around those things, maybe we can start doing a little bit better as far as like connecting everybody and basically building up the coalition that we would need to tackle some heavier issues. So I just kind of want to put that out there to our traditional progressive community that may or may not be into Black politics. I'm not necessarily always doing Black politics myself, but when we have such a dire situation, I find it hard to get on here and talk about the EPA when we have like large examples like Flint, where the EPA just abdicated their responsibility to protect citizenry, and we have basically large sections of the country where the EPA has abdicated their responsibility to the citizenry that are living and dealing with like pollution in their communities. And so, all that being said, point being, that was for the environmental groups, the environmentalists out there. If you're concerned about the environment, but you have nothing to say when the EPA has utterly just failed to uphold its responsibilities in communities of color across the nation, you're just not doing a very good job in building a coalition. And I just wanted you to make you aware of that.
And whatever your dear issue is, there's definitely a way. There's almost certainly a way that it's exploiting and hurting Black people as much or greater way than the way that you've observed it to this point. So the environmental example is a great example in that there's a lot of devastation going on in the environment. But if you look at the environmental racism and the devastation done to communities through that, you'll find a very willing and open community ready to support your cause if only you're willing to consider and value their concerns.
And let's say you don't take my advice to heart about building a coalition and being able to address some of those issues. Let me remind you that the South is right to work for a reason. The labor movement was destroyed for a reason. The peace movement kind of fell apart for a reason. And all of these reasons have been tied to racism in one form or another. So, like, unless we're willing to tackle that, we're really not going to be able to build the coalition we need to build. And I think, from a progressive side standpoint, if you really want to achieve these things, you should be ready to put in some work. And it's going to be some work because you've been raised in a white supremacist society that's trained white supremacy into you, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. It's going to be some work, but that's what's going to have to happen so we can rebuild the labor movement, so we can rebuild the environmental movement, so we can rebuild the I forgot what the other one was. Oh, well, point being, we have to rebuild those things, and only by working through that racial history, that racial past, and the racial context in which we find ourselves today will we really be able to make some progress. I'm gonna let Richard say his last few words, and I'm gonna basically close out with a quote for today.
Yep. Nick mentioned something I think is important is, and so that the progressive community doesn't turn into another democratic community where they've abandoned our concerns and our needs and our values for sake of political expediency and access to corporate cash. I think it's important that we challenge these progressive spaces where they fall short. And one of the places that happens, we addressed one last plug on an upcoming episode of The Discourse, and I think that people should definitely check that out. We also talked about prosecutors and a bit about the justice system in general, and I just found it to be a very enlightening and invaluable episode, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you again, Nick, for letting me be a part of this, and I think it's important that we represent, and sometimes our language can be dismissive of the people that have worked tirelessly to keep these movements, be it the environmental movement, civil rights movement, or any other movements that we've seen. People work tirelessly to keep them at least as a part of the national conscious, and even when it's not popular or not an easy job. And so it's not for the lack of their effort that these movements have sputtered in various ways, but as a collective social issue of us not doing our job as a society from all levels, from the very top on to the bottom. Some of us have not lived up to our obligations in ways that we can and maybe should, and it's important that we challenge ourselves as well as those with more power than us if we're going to actually make this better. So that would be my parting piece.
All right. I want to thank you guys for staying with us. Here's our quote for today. And what's funny about this quote is that everybody remembers the last sentence, but to me, the more powerful piece of the quote is everything but the last sentence. So this is a quote from Frederick Douglass, and it says, the whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all tumults to silence. It must do this, or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Now comes the part that everybody knows. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. Think about that quote. Think about why the whole beginning of that quote is so much more important than the last sentence. But yeah, we always remember the last sentence, but we need to make sure we remember everything. With that, if there is no struggle, there is no progress.